All right. So I was tasked, I guess I didn't even mean to do this, but we put together who's going to teach what in what order. We sort of debated, like, should we do every other one? Should we have somebody do three, three, three? As Dan Meredith will be teaching after me, and then Jacob Bellwood after him. And of course, I get the first lesson here on submission, which is something that I have struggled with mightily in my life in certain ways, whether it be to the government or to the workforce. I'm very much the kind of person that when people talk to me about my job, something that I have likely said, and I don't mean it in a bad way, it's just something that I say is, I strive every day to never have a boss. That's like my thing, right? But I don't mean that in a negative way. It's just kind of how my life has taken me in certain directions. And so I wanted to ask you guys first, there's ever been a time in your adult life that you have felt that you've had to be submissive that has been very difficult to be, or maybe has felt a little bit unfair? Obviously, when we were kids, we can be like, well, mom and dad wanted me to eat dinner and clear my plate or whatever. But I just mean maybe in the last 5-10 years. Yeah, awesome. Yeah. Driving the speed limit is very, very difficult. Yeah. And then you get into the argument with the people that are like, you're not allowed to ever drive. You meet people in the world, and it doesn't matter if you're one of these people or not. But I mean, I've met people that are like, literally, like, you cannot go 1 mile an hour over the speed limit or you're sinning. I've had that conversation, and I'm like, no, man, I'm going to get to where I'm going. So that's a good example. Anyone else? I had a work situation where in my previous job, this is part of the reason why I have attitude a little bit, one of the things that I was expected to do was hire pretty much anyone. Right? I've been in insurance since I got out of college, and if you work for these big corporate insurance entities, if you're looking for a job, just know they will hire you. It does not matter. You are interviewing them. They are not actually interviewing you, right? Because the whole philosophy of the company that I used to work for was, if they walk in the front door, get them into sales school, right? Like, it doesn't matter, whatever. And there was a guy that came in. The interview was absolutely horrible, but it doesn't matter because I have to hire them, right? And I called my boss up and I was like, I don't want to train with this person. I don't want to be in the car with them. They don't have good hygiene, right? They're clearly not someone that I think is going to fit my personality and my team. I don't think that they're necessarily going to work hard, right? And I was told, nope, you haven't put anybody in sales school in 2 weeks, and you have to have 4 a month, and so this guy's willing to say yes, and so you have to do it. You have to hire. Yep, absolutely 100%. And I was like, okay, all right, I guess, like, this is my job. I have to do this. So we sent that guy off or whatever, and he got back, and 6 months later, I promoted that guy because he worked really, really, really hard and listened to me and followed instruction and was maybe had a little, I had to have the conversation about the hygiene thing, which was tough when I'm like 26 and he's like 56. That was a tough conversation to have, but a good one to have. And he did it, and he was great. And I left that company before he did. That was a hard thing for me to have to deal with, the fact that I just did not want to do this at all. I think God kind of woke me up a little bit in that moment of, maybe have some patience. Anybody else? Yes. Yep. We are going to get into that. That is part of our study today, but I do agree with that. Why is that? we, yeah, yeah. Sometimes it can be tough to just submit to either authority or, roles in life. That can be hard. Um, Obviously, like with good communication, husbands are submitting to their wives, and it's not something that um, wives have to feel like they're doing something beyond what they should have to do. Right? Anybody else? Time that you have maybe either felt maybe something was a little unfair. All right. I think we all pretty much went through this maybe a couple years ago, right? The question of, do I wear a mask? Do I not? Do I take certain medicine? Do I stay home, right? We had all that happen about 5 or 6 years ago, and it really divided a lot of people, right? I think this is something that now in 2026 we could talk about a little bit more than we could even a year or two ago, right? But there are still people that are very heavily opinionated about what happened about 4 or 5 years ago, right? That was a very tough thing to deal with. And the scriptures that we're going to read today, I don't necessarily want to get into all that or whatever, but I think the scriptures that we're going to read today, interestingly enough, there were people that used what we're going to go over as a way to attack one another. Like, you're not being submissive enough. But then on the flip side, there were people that want to say, well, I don't have to submit in this way, right? Like, we don't have to be submissive if we don't want to, right? There's a little bit of that having to focus on ourselves. I think all of us, in the example of, having the speed limit is annoying, potentially getting pulled over and getting a ticket, and sometimes those tickets are kind of expensive, depending on if you get the police officer that, did you get a ticket? Yeah, there you go, see? Right? Was it a lot, or was it one of the little ones? Oh, okay, yeah. But you never know, like, that's part of the dread, right? Is like, oh no, is this gonna be one of those $150 ones, right? But that's the lay of the land. All right, so let's go ahead and start with 1 Peter chapter 2. We're going to be in verses 13 through 17. If somebody go ahead and read all of those verses for me, 13 through 17. Thank you very much. So in this section, we're very much talking about a submission towards the government. Anybody have trouble with wanting to do that? Right? Yeah. I think a lot of us in here are likely pretty opinionated about the government, about politics, about, do I want more government or do I want less? Right? So reading this, for some of us, is actually very difficult. This idea that we are to act as free people, but to submit ourselves to our King. I put down that a lot of times the word submission often carries a negative meaning in today's culture. We associate it with weakness, oppression, or even losing one's identity. I think that is the way that I've felt about sometimes when I talk to people about submitting to the government, paying taxes, things like that. If you want to get me riled up, let's talk about paying tax on your vehicle, right? Yeah? I call it tax on tax. And Thomas Thomas always laughs. He's like, Dad, what are you so mad about? I'm like, I'm paying my tax on tax today. I got to go. Got to go to the annex, right? I think many of us feel that way. But for biblical submission, what that means is that we are voluntarily yielding to God's established order, trusting God even when circumstances seem unfair, choosing humility over pride, or following the example of Christ. One thing I always like to go back to actually is in Romans 13, 1 through 7. Turn there. Somebody read for me Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7. Loudly, please. Oh, that's thank you. I think I may have told you to read. Meant just verse 7. Thank you. Thank you for reading all that. That was kind of a long section. These things really go together, right? Because when we look at 1 Peter 2, 13 through 17 in this, what type of attitude are we supposed to have in submission to authority? What is our, yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really actually a good way to look at it, to behave ourselves, right? I don't think I've ever thought about it that way, but you know, a rule is not a rule without a punishment, either good or bad consequences. So we have to find a way to behave ourselves. That is a way to worship God, right? To be in submission, to show that you're doing the right thing, to show a good example. But what is the difference between submission and weakness? Is there a difference? Yes. Okay, submission is voluntary. Weakness is the way you are, the way you feel. Yeah. Yeah, Jesus was not weak. These people were it actually takes a lot of gumption, a lot of humility. Yeah, I mean, the people that are writing these things are not doing this out of fear. And that's what they're telling us, is to not be afraid of these situations, right? Because why? Why should we not be afraid of the government or governing authority if we're submitting correctly? God's in control, yeah. Also, just at the end of the day, you know, if you're not speeding, you don't get a ticket, right? And there, yeah. Well, no. Well, you can't. You can. Well, I just mean, yeah, yeah. There are, and think, right, right. Bad things can happen to you, yes, but I'm talking about like like the consciousness of I'm just not going to do this thing, right? Like I don't want to submit to the job that I have or the government, like the governing authorities at all, right? If you just say I'm not going to do that, likely there are things that are bad that can happen to you. However, I did want to bring up an example of, do we have to just do what the government tells us to do? Yeah, yeah. Not if it goes against how we're supposed to worship and praise, right? We're talking about submission in doing the things that we're supposed to do and working hard and showing the type of person that we are, right? That we're not somebody that's just going to go against just for no reason. Yeah, Keith? Yeah. Well, yeah. I have the exact same thoughts. That's why I'm saying this one was kind of tough for me. But yeah, we can do that. Yeah. But there are people that just have authority over us, and we may think that that's fair or unfair. People that make decisions that we don't make, and we might think that that's fair or unfair. I mean, I think sometimes there's this sentiment like, well, you voted for this, right? So you should just deal with it. If you voted for some politician and then that politician ended up just lying and not doing what they said they were going to do, you voted for them and now you got to eat it because you voted for that person, right? I think that is a sentiment that is said all the time these days on both sides, right? Yeah, Dan. Right. That's I I think that's perfect in looking at again, revisiting verse 16 when it says, act as free people and do not use your freedom as a covering for evil, but use it as bondservants of God. So we are free to choose. We're free to have our own opinions and be who we want to be. But in submitting or having a submissive lifestyle, it is sort of this idea, kind of like you were talking about, is not complaining all the time. That doesn't mean that we can't be frustrated every so often, but we actually, when I was in college, we had a Bible study, a men's Bible study. We used to read 1 Peter 2:17 all the time. That was how we opened it up. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, and honor the king. And I think that just, it summed up how we're supposed to feel in our life, right? We are supposed to love our neighbors. We are supposed to honor all people, love the brotherhood, put the saints in the brotherhood and the people that you worship with ahead of yourself in a lot of ways. Fear God and keep his commandments. Honor the king. All of those things, they go, it was just such a good way to remind ourselves who we are and why we're together. Yes. Yep. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, God is in authority overall. Exactly, yeah. Right. Yeah. It's very difficult in an age where we can express our feelings at all times to as many people as we want to when they're not asking for it. um, but that is where that has become tougher in our life, is very similar to what Dan was talking about. You know, we go to work and we submit, or we live in this world and we feel like we're super humble, and then we gush it out in other places. And then all that does is make people wonder, like, oh, that person really doesn't have a good attitude about certain things. And then maybe they have a bad impression of you as a Christian in certain things. Yeah. Yeah, one more. It is. And it's like that, but that is, the challenge is that a lot of times we do see that as a weakness. Is that we see that as, I have to care also about the people that I didn't vote for, right? Or that I don't necessarily think about or maybe like or have a friendship with. But that's not, it's not weak. It is actually stronger to not express yourself just vomiting all over the place, right? Much harder to do that, again, especially today when everybody can find some type of echo chamber wherever they want to. If you really want to find a pocket of people that think exactly the way you think, you can find that, and that world then feels way bigger, right? You might find 200 people that agree with you, and it's like, oh yeah, everybody agrees with me. It's like, well, 200 people, it's not that many, right? You can find it, right? Yes. So that's a great segue into what I was going to talk about here. So I asked the same question. Reading in Romans, reading this, it talks about to be free in our will, but to submit, to pay taxes, to follow the government. And sometimes when you read those things, I do think like, man, is it literally just saying like, if there is a law, I just have to do it? If this scenario comes up and I'm not allowed to go to church, like I should just, I guess not, right? And I think back to in Daniel. Daniel 1, the first portion of it, when they are taken into captivity and they are supposed to eat the food that the king has set forth in front of them, and it's unclean food. And he can't consciously eat this food. So he goes to the guard, and in verse 12 says, please test your servants for 10 days, let them be given vegetables to eat and water to drink, then examine our appearance and the appearance of young men who are eating the king's food, and deal with your servants based on what you see. He agreed with them about this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked better and healthier than all the young men who were eating the king's food. So the guard continued to remove their food and wine, and they were to drink and give them vegetables. And later, it says that Nebuchadnezzar had met with him and gave him a role, basically in the king's court, called Cyrus. So this time, he went to the king and said, hey, we're starving, we look bad, we're sick. Let me show you something that we can eat, and then we'll be healed, we'll look better, we'll be able to serve you better. And God took favor on him for doing that. So that was an example of Daniel still submitting and finding a way to go to the authority figures, try to figure out how we can work this out. And that time it did work. But when did it not work? And in Daniel 6, we all know specifically, right? Daniel 6, starting in verse 10, it says, when Daniel learned that the document that was signed that says that you cannot pray in public, right? Daniel learned that the document had been signed. He went into his house. The windows in its upstairs room opened toward Jerusalem. And 3 times a day he got on his knees, prayed, and gave thanks to God, just as he'd done before. Then the men went as a group and found Daniel, petitioning and imploring his God. So they approached the king and asked about his edict. Didn't you sign an edict for that 30 days, any person who petitions any god or man except you, the king will be thrown, the king will be thrown in the lion's den? The king answered, as a law of the Medes and the Persians, the order stands and is irrevocable. So then we know what happens next, right? He actually gets thrown in the lion's den because he's done this. And we know part of the story is that the king was actually tricked into this, into signing this edict a little bit, right? They didn't like Daniel. But he says 2 times that he's submitted to the king, the authority figure, and one time he was granted favor, and the other time it was like, well, I mean, I guess you did do this. So was Daniel sinning by opening his window and praying, even though the law said no other God can be worshipped other than the king? If we are to act as free people but not use your freedom as a covering for evil, but use it as bondservants for God, we're supposed to pay taxes, we're supposed to do what we're supposed to do. It's interesting, we're given examples of that very thing. Yes, Matt. Yeah, yeah. Right. 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 Right, right, yeah. Yeah. Which is also a big deal because when he did it, right, it's, this like, wow, this person can break the law and go to jail or whatever. And I mean, that's hurting the king, it's hurting the government, it's hurting a lot of people under, but I mean, that's a great point that you can't just take it upon yourself. All right. So we get into the next portion of it in verses 18 through 25. So if somebody could read me 18 through 25. Thank you. So this is something that I think specifically verse 18 can be very, very difficult for a lot of people just in general. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and gentle, but also to those who are harsh. Is it easy to work for someone who is harsh to you? I think very many of us in this room, if not all of us, if I said, hey, who's had a bad boss in here, right? Most people would raise their hand, right? Or maybe not a boss, or maybe somebody that you just worked with or for. Maybe you were on a project or something, and that you're like the project manager or something who was supposed to be taking it over just was horrible at direction. It is very, very easy to work for or to be submissive to someone who is gentle and kind, even if they're not the best at what they're doing, right? Like, again, I think some of us probably have had some authority figures that might not be super great at their job, but because they're nice and kind and gentle to us, it makes it easy to just sort of follow their direction and maybe pick up the slack where it needs to be made, right? It says, for what credit is there when you sin and are harshly treated, but endure it with patience? But if when you do what is right and suffer for it, you patiently endure it, this finds favor with God. By suffering, that is one way that we find favor in God, because that is harder to do, right? I think 3 times in Ecclesiastes, Solomon tells us it's better to go to the house of mourning. And it's tough because we're always seeking, I want a better job that's going to pay me more money. Or how many times have you met somebody? This just happened to me a couple weeks ago. I had a friend of mine that was like, hey, I had to leave my job because the people around me were tearing me down. That is a tough thing to do, but it happens all the time. So it's hard to be in that situation where you have to suffer and submit, and maybe you can't get out of those situations. That's why then next, it uses Christ as our example. I looked up what other Old Testament examples for sort of this type of thing that may have been hard. And it took me to, and it kind of goes along with both of these things, which is in Genesis 39 through 41, when Joseph, he's ran away from Potiphar's wife. Potiphar doesn't believe him. He gets put in jail. And he doesn't try to break out of prison, right? What does he do? He serves even when it was unjust. And he continues for a long time to serve and suffer and submit. And then later on, he is rewarded again by being the interpreter of dreams. So, we use Christ as our example in verse 21. For you have been called for this purpose, because Christ has also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you who will follow in his steps. He who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth, and while being abusively insulted, he did not insult in return. While suffering, he did not threaten, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. It's not easy. I mean, how many times I think about how I feel like I do something right, and then if I'm not rewarded for that, sometimes I can kind of bum you out, right? Probably like a lot of a lot of jobs will have like award ceremonies, like top salesperson of the year, or you know, newcomer, rookie of the year, things like that. Because people are kind of seeking a pat on the back from time to time, right? So when we just never get that, kind of grate on us a little bit, make us feel a little bit weary. But Jesus, he was really disrespected, right? In every single way imaginable. And continued to show that submission, which can be very, very difficult. We don't necessarily have time to go. I'll start in chapter 3. I know it's going to get into the submission between husband and wives. I think that will bleed into next week. Does anybody have any other comment? Thank you. Yeah, totally agree. One last thing I wanted to bring up, and I didn't add this to my notes here, is going back to verses 13 through 17. Peter gives us 3 reasons as to why to submit. In verse 13, and this goes along with what you just said. In verse 13, it is for the Lord's sake. In verse 14, it is or in verse 15, it is to silence the ignorant, foolish people. And in verse 16, it is because we are servants of God. And that I hope you can take away at least something. All right?